What would you do if your public school teacher made fun of you in front of the whole class and then unjustly accused you of cheating on a test? This story is taken from when Don Bosco was around 15 years old and was trying to pursue his studies so that he could fulfill his dream of becoming a priest. Let's see how a saint would handle this situation. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The life of a student in those days was far more difficult than it is now. Today, there are many schools and similar institutions where promising students can find shelter and pursue their studies. Not so in the early 1800s, when most people were poor. The first problem of rural parents whose sons wished to become priests or get an education was to find them suitable living quarters in the towns or cities. Sometimes 2 or 3 students shared a room in a boarding house or friend's house, but for the most part, they lived in tiny attic rooms alone or with a companion. The board or rent was paid with wheat, corn, wine, or perhaps by part-time work. The landlord would provide the food, usually a bowl of soup, or the boy's family would send him a weekly supply of bread. Often the boys would leave home with several sacks of flour, corn, potatoes, and chestnuts, their food supply for the whole year. No matter how cold the winter, heat was out of the question, since they couldn't afford the prohibitive price of firewood. Poor students had to provide for their needs either by copying manuscripts, or tutoring, or taking some part-time job. Thus we shall see John spending a good part of his day in things that in no way fostered his studies in order to lessen his mother's financial burden. This explains his habit of studying at night and leading a mode of life he described as dissipated, but which, in view of the results, should rather be considered providential. At first he made 2 round trips to school a day, both morning and afternoon, in all some 12 miles, sometimes in terrible weather. The loss of time, of course, that this led to had a detrimental effect on his studies, and soon he changed his schedule, leaving Becky in the morning and returning only in the evening. At Castelnuovo, he would slip into his shoes again and leave his school satchel and his lunch at the house of a Mr. Giovanni Roberto. There he would eat his lunch between classes. In extremely bad weather, he would remain overnight in the village, sleeping in a cubby hole under a staircase where a family had kindly given him permission to take shelter. To keep expenses down, and also to watch over John, Mama Margaret at first agreed to this daily hike to and from school, but since the winter was becoming ever more severe, she soon realized she would have to board and lodge him in Castelnuovo, and did so. Castelnuovo was the most important town in the area, and consequently many boys gave themselves airs and considered themselves a cut above the simple folk of the hamlets, whom they looked down upon as socially inferior and ignorant. Thus, in the first days, taking advantage of John's quiet ways, they began to poke fun at him and his clothes. Often they would run after him on tiptoe, tug at the flaps of his jacket, and then run off to a safe distance, passing quips to one another. "The pastor must have given him that jacket," or "It's really the latest style. Could it have belonged to his grandfather?" John never lost his temper, but patiently endured their rudeness and their taunts. Sometimes he would turn round to smile at them and say, "You rascals, why don't you behave and leave me in peace? Am I bothering you?" His classmates also made fun of him and gave him a derisive nickname because of his height among so many smaller boys. But this baiting soon ceased, thanks to his good disposition. Then he began to entertain them with his usual light-hearted tricks. A kind mouth multiplies friends, and gracious lips prompt friendly greetings, as it says in the book of Sirach. Meanwhile, John was able to carry out his devotions here with greater ease than at Morialdo. Municipal schools were then prevalently religious in character, in accordance with the decrees of the king in 1822. Boys and girls attended separate classes. A crucifix hung prominently in every classroom, and the students prayed together often throughout the day. The first half hour of class was devoted to catechism instruction, as was also the entire afternoon session on Sunday, which ended with the Litany of the Blessed Virgin. Teachers had to agree with the pastor concerning the pupils attending Mass before class and going to confession once a month, because piety is the path to wisdom. One day, the teacher assigned an Italian composition on Eleazar, who chose to die rather than give scandal by eating pork meat in the times of the Old Testament. John developed the theme so skillfully that nobody could believe he had written it himself. His composition passed from teacher to teacher, and all thought it superb. Everything was wonderful until it fell into the hands of a certain Father Molia. He read it over carefully, and his opinion was that among the educated people in the area, no one was learned enough to write such a fine composition, and that consequently it was impossible for young Bosco to have done so. When John heard of this, he realized that he had fallen from the good graces of his teacher. Indeed, by one of those strange, inexplicable changes that sometimes take place in the human heart, Father Molia got the idea that it would be better for the young peasant boy of Becky to give up his studies and return to the farm. Why this should happen, only God knows. This new setback again put to the test John's perseverance and trust in God. One day, while this critical teacher was giving a test to determine class rank, John requested permission to do the one assigned to the third-year students. Father Molia burst out laughing. "I must say that for a Becky boy, you're a bit pretentious. What good is anyone from Becky? Why don't you quit Latin? You'll never understand a word of it. Use your time looking for mushrooms or birds' nests. That's one thing you should be good for. There's where your true talent lies. I think you'll be a great success at that. Why you're studying Latin at all is really odd to me." But John insisted, and gave no sign of having been stung by those words. But the teacher's reply was even more caustic. However, seeing that John was determined in his request, he finally told him to take whatever test he wanted. He, for one, wasn't going to read the nonsense that John would most certainly write. The third-year students had been given a Latin passage to translate. Within the hour, John turned in his translation. Without even looking at it, the teacher took it, placed it on his desk, and gave John a pitiful smile. But John remained there, facing him. "Please, Father, would you look at it and correct my mistakes?" "Didn't I tell you that Becky boys know nothing?" the teacher replied irritatedly. "I told you that these things are simply beyond you." At this, several of the pupils jumped up and pleaded with their teacher. "Yes, read Bosco's paper, Father, please. Let's hear all the nonsense he has written." Father Molia, who by now had become quite pliable in the hands of his pupils, met their demand. He took up the paper and read it. The translation was correct. As he put it down, he exclaimed, "Just as I said, Bosco's a good-for-nothing. He's copied this whole translation from someone else. Obviously, he must have copied it. This certainly isn't his work." John's schoolmate, who had shared the same desk with him and had seen John at work without recourse to books or help from anyone, spoke up in his defense. "Father, you say that Bosco copied from someone else. If he did, there would be a composition that would match his. Why don't you look at our work and see if there's any translation that looks like his?" This sounded like a reasonable request, and it should certainly have put an end to the matter, but the teacher refused to budge. He sharply reproved the lad who had spoken up. "What do you know about it? Haven't you heard me say that anyone from Becky isn't good for anything?" There was no way to persuade him of the truth. In his blind prejudice, he cared little about learning the real facts. But the boy who had seen John work on his own translation told his friends exactly what had happened. As a result, John's classmates not only admired his talent, but very highly regarded his humility and dignity in the face of those abusive words. This incident greatly heightened their esteem and admiration for John Bosco and increased his influence among them. Although he possessed an incredible intellect, God would later give him a prophetic insight into what questions were going to be asked on tests, much to the confusion of everyone who witnessed it. But I'm going to save that story for Friday, so please subscribe and come back then. If the episode's already been launched by the time you watch this video, it should appear right here. If not, just come back Friday. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.